Hi, my name is Charles Wells, and what I'd like to talk to you today about is Alberta separation. Now, this video is going to be in response to a video that I watched um, presented by the Alberta Prosperity Project, and its keynote speaker was a Dr. Dennis Moodry. Now, in this talk, a presentation by Dr. Moodry, he referred to what he called sections 154 and 155 of the Quebec secession decision from 1998, rendered by the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, I'm going to refer to them as paragraphs 154 and 155 because it's my understanding that that's what they are referred to in the document. Just a bit of housekeeping. So I'll be referring to paragraphs 154 and 155, not section 154 and 155. Now, I'm not 100% sure if Dr. Moodry is using these two as support for his ideas on separation or if he is railing against them. But either way, my presentation today is about how I perceive these paragraphs to read. It's my position that these are basically explaining to Canadians that while Alberta separation is possible in a theoretical context, it requires an amendment of the Constitution to be realized. Without an amendment to the Constitution, Alberta separation is not possible. Okay? There is no recognition in Canadian law or international law for unilateral separation, which I think Mr. Moodry might be hinting at in his presentation, but again, it's my presumption. Don't want to put words into his mouth. So with that, this presentation is going to be limited to just paragraph 154. I'm going to do a separate video on 155. So to keep this somewhat short, maybe in the neighborhood of 20 minutes if I can, I would like to go through the 7 sentences of paragraph 154 to explain why I believe the Supreme Court is instructing Canadians that unilateral separation is not possible. Okay, so the first sentence reads, "We have also considered whether a positive legal entitlement to secession exists under international law in the factual circumstances contemplated by question 1, i.e., a clear democratic expression of support on a clear question for Quebec secession." Now, wherever I read the word Quebec, please feel free to insert the word Alberta, because it's my understanding that the Supreme Court has already considered this matter, and they don't want to have to go back and redo all of this work again. So where it says Quebec secession in this document, you should insert the word Alberta secession, because I believe that it applies equally to all provinces. You could insert any province's name here. It doesn't matter. It just happened to be Quebec first. Okay? So the first sentence, in my opinion, is just informing us that the Supreme Court is considering this question. They're giving it their full consideration. Now, the second sentence reads, "Some of those who support an affirmative answer to this question did so on the basis of recognized right to self-determination that belongs to all peoples." Now, the word peoples is in quotation marks. They're using quotation marks because the word peoples is not going to be used in a general sense, as in all the peoples of earth, or all we the people, or the people over there, or whatever general context you might come up with. It is going to be narrowed down to a very specific definition that is recognized in international law. So the Supreme Court is considering the people as being defined in a narrow context. So that's what my interpretation, sentence 2, is all about. Okay, now, sentence 3. This is a big one. There's a lot of words in this one. Although much of the Quebec, Alberta population certainly shares many of the characteristics of a people, it is not necessary to describe the people, in quotation marks, issue, because whatever may be the correct determination of this issue in the context of Quebec, a right to secession only arises under the principle of self-determination of peoples at international law, where a people is governed as part of a colonial empire, where a people is subject to alien subjugation, domination, or exploitation, and possibly where a people is denied any meaningful exercise of its right to self-determination within the state of which it forms a part. Now, granted, that's a very big sentence, and there's lots of wordy words in there. However, the Supreme Court is very, I don't know how to describe this, I guess, because my vocabulary isn't as good as theirs. But they can pack a lot of information into a short space because they are very excellent wordsmiths. Their command of the English and French language is unparalleled, and their ability to express themselves in a very clear and concise manner is unparalleled. So I consider it a privilege to read these kind of words so I can increase my knowledge of things that I really don't understand that well. And hopefully that will help you as well. So in this sentence, they're saying that in the Quebec, Alberta, Manitoba, BC perspective, you would only be considered a people under international law if you were governed by a colonial empire. Well, that may well have been true long ago. You know, depending on your perspective, prior to July 1st, 1867, or possibly after the 1931 Westminster Act, or possibly the 1982 constitutional amendments, whatever your perspective might be. My perspective is that Canada is not part of a colonial empire anymore, and hasn't been for a very long time. So, where a people is subject to alien subjugation, well, we're not subject to alien subjugation. All of the members of the legislature, of any legislature in Canada, are all Canadian citizens. Find me one that's not, and I'll retract that statement. Also, all of the members of the House of Commons and the Senate are Canadian citizens. If you can find me one that's not, I'll withdraw that statement. All of the members of the judiciary, all of the judges, up to and including the Supreme Court justices, are Canadian citizens. If you could find me one that's not, I'll withdraw that position. The one exception would be the sovereign of the country, King Charles III. He's not a citizen of Canada. However, as sovereign, he has certain rights bestowed upon him under the Constitution. So I would not consider King Charles III to be alien to Canada in the sense that's understood in international law. But if you want to argue that, fill your boots, as we say in Alberta. Okay, now, dominance or exploitation. Well, here's where Dr. Moodry might have a place to make an argument. He could make, probably a pretty good argument for domination and exploitation. Okay. However, I don't think that that argument is going to, as Jeffrey Rath might say, hold much water, because Canadians are not denied any meaningful exercise of their right to self-determination within the state that they live in. Okay? The evidence of this is the 1982 constitutional amendments themselves, of which Alberta signed on to, I might add. 9 out of the 10 provinces did sign on to the constitutional amendments. So the constitutional amendments of 1982 granted a recognition of the rights of the people to freedom of, well, many, many freedoms. So that wouldn't have existed without the right of the people of Canada to express their right to self-determination. Now, some of you will probably pipe up and say, oh, we don't have a constitution. It wasn't ratified by Quebec. Which is true. Quebec didn't sign on to the Constitution. Okay, but I take the position that who cares? Doesn't matter. Because if you read the Constitution, what it actually says is the amending formula is that 7 of 10 provinces that make up 50% of the population are required to amend the Constitution. Well, what are you crying about? 9 of 10 provinces that make up probably at least 75% of the population signed on. So it didn't matter that Quebec didn't sign on, because the requirements for the amending process were met by the other 9 provinces. This is a very important concept to understand. So Quebec can jump up and down and light their hair on fire if they want, but at the end of the day, the adults in the room recognize that the amending formula criteria was met. So regardless of whether they signed on or not, they are part of the Constitution. Okay. Now, that being said, if Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia were to gang up on the rest of Canada, that population would be, roughly 72% of Canada. So it would meet the 50% requirement. However, if the other 7 provinces voted against the proposed amendments by Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, doesn't matter, because you need 7 of 10. So this is why our Constitution is so incredibly written. It's the best document in the world, in my opinion, because it allows a balance of power. So the big provinces can't gang up on the little provinces. If you're one province screaming out there in the wilderness, it might behoove you to go back and rethink your position a little bit before you start declaring separation. That's all I'm saying. Conversely, like if it had been Quebec and say Prince Edward Island and say Nova Scotia that didn't sign the Constitution, again, it wouldn't matter, because there would still be 7 of 10 making up 50% of the population. Okay, it's what people don't seem to grasp, even though this information is not hidden from you. It's right there for you to see if you just read it. Okay, it's not my opinion. It's what the document actually says. Okay. So let's go on to the next sentence. This one's much shorter, so this will be quicker. Okay. In other circumstances, peoples are expected to achieve self-determination within the framework of their existing state. So, as the previous sentence does not apply to Canada, what this sentence is saying, without actually saying it, if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, they're describing Canada. In other circumstances, meaning us, peoples are expected to achieve self-determination within the framework of their existing state. They're saying, work it out internally. Put on your big boy, big girl shoes and go into the legislature or the parliament and propose amendments to the Constitution that are agreeable to the other members of the family. Okay? That's what they're asking you to do, essentially, in my opinion. Very important stuff. Okay. Now, here's where we get to some very important stuff as well. Now, I want to make sure that I don't... this is another long sentence again, so bear with me on this one. Buckle up, as I would say. A state whose government represents the whole of the people or peoples resident within its territory, meaning Albertans, on a basis of equality, without discrimination, and respects the principles of self-determination in its internal arrangements, is entitled to maintain its territorial integrity under international law, and to have that territorial integrity recognized by other states. Okay. Well, this is an important part, because what it's saying here, Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it is a country that exists on the basis of equality without discrimination. Who among you is going to say different? Mr. Moodry, fill your boots. Okay. Canada respects self-determination in its internal arrangements. There's nothing that prevents you from determining from self-determination. Nothing. You might not get what you want when you ask for it, but when I was a kid, my mother and father didn't give me everything that I asked for either, right? They were the adults in the room, and they decided what was best for me. If they thought that my request was reasonable, then they would grant my request. If they thought my request was unreasonable, they would not. That's how I was raised, just saying. Okay. So Canada has a right to maintain its internal territorial integrity. So what's important about this statement is that this is going to jump into the Clarity Act a little bit. I'm going to do a separate video on the Clarity Act. So keep this video in mind when I talk about the Clarity Act in future videos. Because even if your referendum is successful, that only leads to negotiations. Okay. Now, Mr. Wilson has incorrectly characterized these negotiations as being good faith negotiations. And I'm calling out Mr. Wilson to retract that video, because it's my position that any negotiations in the future are not going to be considered good faith negotiations. Labor, Mr. Wilson already knows this. I don't need to explain this to Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson is a very experienced litigator, has lots of experience in these types of matters. So I was very disappointed in Mr. Wilson when he framed the negotiations as having to be good faith negotiations. They are, in my opinion, adversarial negotiations. Even though the Clarity Act doesn't say that they are adversarial, they also say they're not considered to be good faith negotiations, because they have to walk the middle path. They can't be biased and prejudiced in their words. So they just say negotiations. The goodwill portion was added by Mr. Wilson, and this, in my opinion, is incorrect. Okay, just saying. So when you do, or if you do, so let's say your referendum is successful and you do get enough people from what's considered to be a clear majority, and that's going to be a topic for another video, then you get to move to the negotiation phase. Well, in that negotiation phase, you will be told by the Crown that they do not have to give up one single centimeter of land to the separatists without a constitutional amendment. You have to negotiate that with the Crown. And if the Crown says, no, we're not giving you any land, that's their position. There's nothing in international law that would allow you to unilaterally take any land, mines, or minerals from Canada for your own selfish purposes. That does not exist in international law. Know that. They're not kidding around here when they tell you this. This is very serious stuff. These people write Supreme Court in such clear and unequivocal language that I don't understand how the Alberta Prosperity Project focuses on Alberta separation. I could see them focusing on things that could be accomplished, in my opinion, a better use of their time, rather than wasting it on Alberta separation. Because at the end of the day, they require a constitutional amendment, and, well, it took 50 years to get the last one. The 1982 amendments were really spearheaded by the Westminster Act of 1931. So from the date in 1931 that act was passed till July 1st, 1982 was 50 years. So, if you think this is going to happen in your lifetime, I don't think so. Anywho, the second to last sentence. This is sentence number 6. I'm going to insert the word Alberta here because I believe that that's reasonable in this situation. Even though the text of the document says Quebec, I'm going to read it with the word Alberta. Okay, it's my paraphrasing. This is not the words of the Supreme Court, just for clarification here. Quebec/Alberta does not meet the threshold of a colonial people or an oppressed people, nor can it be suggested that Quebecers have been denied meaningful access to government to pursue their political, economic, cultural, and social developments. Like, how could you say it any better than that? I couldn't. I'm in agreement with this position that Alberta does not meet the threshold of a colonial people or an oppressed people, nor can it be suggested that Alberta has been denied meaningful access to government to pursue their political, economic, cultural, and social development. They might not be getting their way. However, it might behoove them to look at the way that they're doing it and try a different method, because the one that they're using hasn't worked so far. Just the suggestion to throw out there. Okay? So the last sentence, it's kind of a wind down and kind of puts it all into perspective, but very clear and unequivocal, make no doubt about that. In the circumstances, the National Assembly, the legislature, or the government of Quebec do not enjoy a right at international law to effect the secession of Quebec from Canada unilaterally. Now, let's read that again with the words Alberta in there. In the circumstances, the legislature or the government of Alberta do not enjoy a right at international law to effect the secession of Alberta from Canada unilaterally. Okay? I believe that Mr. Moodry and Chris Scott have indicated that they're happy with unilateral separation. Essentially, once they get 60% of the vote or whatever it is that they determine to be a clear majority, and I'm going to get into what I believe that is in another video, that they're going to be an independent nation, and we're going to start issuing passports, and all we need is international recognition. Now, that international recognition that they're talking about, gets covered in paragraph 155, which is not the topic of this presentation. I'm just sticking strictly to 154. But in the next one, I'll be doing 155, which will be, in my opinion, a slam dunk that will pretty much kill this idea of Alberta separation. Okay? Like, this is putting it to bed. And if you can't understand these words and you still want to support this idea of Alberta separation, that's absolutely fair. That's your right. And I will be on that wall defending your right to express whatever it is you want to express. But I'll also be on that wall laughing at you because I think it's a waste of time and your money. You're donating money to people who, in my opinion, are not going to be able to produce any results at the end of the day. Okay, so if you want to take your hard-earned money and spend it frivolously, again, that's your right. I would never restrict you from doing that. I would just suggest that you keep your money in your pocket and don't donate it to the Alberta Prosperity Project, because at the end of the day, I think that they're selling snake oil. Shout out to Steve Earle and his wonderful song with the same name. Anywho, I'm going to leave it there for this video, but stay tuned for video number 2 from Chucky 2. It's going to talk about Section 155 of the Quebec Secession Act. Have a great day.